And my name is Alex Blanchette. I'm the Interim Director of Environmental Studies here at Tufts. And before I introduce today's speaker, I was hoping to call up Jim Glazier, the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Tufts.
Thank you, and Reverend White-Hammond, welcome to Tufts. We're super excited to hear your remarks today, and this is the first Hawk Cunningham Lunch and Learn of the year, and so I first of all want to say thank you to Alex and to Coco, who do such a great job with our environmental studies program and have put together a really remarkable lineup this semester. I've looked at it, and it is filled with scholars and public officials and thought leaders and activists. And so there's just an awful lot to learn through this series. I also want to thank Daphne Cunningham and Roland Hawk for sponsoring this incredible series. This has been going on for several years now. It is great to be able to do it with food again, and creates just the perfect atmosphere for this kind of event. I do want to say one thing about what's going on in the School of Arts and Sciences, which in my opinion is the most exciting thing happening in the school as we speak. We have a cluster of very exciting developments in the school. Last week, the Department of Earth and Ocean Science became the Department of Earth and Climate Science. You bet. We are hiring new faculty in climate science. We are developing a new major in climate science. I think there'll be a minor in climate science that will sit alongside the earth science or geology major that we have in that department. It's a really exciting development. Additionally, environmental studies, UEP, earth and climate sciences will all be relocating to Bromfield Pearson, the old math building. The math department has graduated to the Cummings Center. It's a beautiful building on the outside. It needs a lot of work on the inside. I promise those of you who are moving in, we're going to take care of it and make it very, very nice. But the idea that we're going to have an umbrella that houses all of those departments, plus the Office of Sustainability and our environmental engineers right across the way is super exciting. So this is a sort of cluster of things that are going on in the School of Arts and Sciences. We're putting resources in this area. We feel like it's incredibly exciting. Every time that I talk about it, it seems like there's more to say because each happening sort of leads to the next development. So I hope for those of you who are here for several years that you'll be here to see the fruits of this very exciting set of developments. And with that, I say welcome to this inaugural lecture, and thank you so much, Reverend White-Hammond. Thanks.
And thanks so much for your support, Jim, and also that of Roland and Daphne. I again want to make a plug for this series as a whole. It's always challenging when we've been apart for the better part of 2 years to come back together, but this is really a community meeting space every week, the Hope Cunningham Lectures for Environmental Studies across the campus. And we have a really wide-ranging set of talks this semester. I think this series has always been distinguished by trying to push the purview of what counts as environmental studies, of expanding it. And the talks coming up this semester really cut across and integrate the natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, and arts. A full list is available on our website. We'll be having topics ranging from corporate greenwashing to fermentation to environmental health equity organizing, from plant musicality to cultivating optimism amongst youth activists, from industrialized chicken breeding to relations with urban wildlife such as raccoons. Sorry, I've been trying to really get a raccoon talk for a little while now. So if you'd like to sign up for the listserv for this series, we'll be passing that around. And if you're watching online, there'll be a link posted in the chat. This talk is being recorded and a link will be available in a couple of days. And now I have the distinct honor of introducing the Reverend Mariama White-Hammond to our community. White-Hammond grew up in Dorchester, and she has been a leading voice in cultural organizing, the use of arts to transform social relations, and environmental justice for nearly 20 years. She has served as the director of Project Hip Hop, an organization that uses the arts to encourage youth to speak out on social justice issues. She was the Minister for Ecological Justice for Bethel African Episcopal Methodist Church, and during study at the Boston University School of Theology, she was ordained. In 2018, she founded the new Roots AME Church in Dorchester, where she serves as pastor, and in 2017, she was the Master of Ceremonies for both the massive Women's March on Boston Commons and the Boston People's Climate Mobilization. This is just a sampling of her service, which has been recognized widely with awards such as the Boston NAACP Image Award and the Grist 50 Fixers for 2019. As a website states, she has long worked to embed practices of equity and environmental justice in local spaces, and her work has been underpinned by an intersectional lens that connects together issues of ecology, immigration, climate change, energy policy, and economic justice. Since 2021, she has served as the Chief Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston, where she wears many hats, not least of them the effort to move the city towards its goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2050. So please join me in welcoming the Reverend White-Hammond to the Hoku series. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Okay, so I'm from the Black church tradition. So when I say good afternoon, it's an invitation for you to say good afternoon back. So we'll try it again. Good afternoon. Great. I am going to spend a little time talking, and then I'm hoping we'll have a lot of opportunity to engage. And particularly, I'm going to be focusing on this idea of what it means for Boston to be a Green New Deal city. So I was a little late this afternoon, partially because I was in the midst of that conversation. We had a city council hearing. Boston has introduced a home rule petition to set out fossil-free standards for all new buildings in Boston, which is in alignment with a lot of other things we've already been doing. We were already working on a net zero zoning code. We already introduced in affordable housing new design standards that move our affordable housing to be net zero. So we've been moving along this track, but it was an interesting moment because I got on, gave my preamble, and just as I was about to leave my own city councilor, who is known for making sure that we raise those challenging issues, but not in a mild way. And so just before I left, there were a few questions that he wanted me to address. And I think in many ways, it's reflective of some of the challenges that we face in the way that environmentalism has existed to this point, and the opportunity we have to shift our frame. So I know that many of you study this directly, and I just want to put in a little plug for the community engagement class. And if you find a campaign to work on, I can't tell you how many environmental justice organizations are looking to hire people, but they're looking to hire people who are not afraid to talk to people and engage with them. And that's not always the case in this field. So I hope more of you will get that skill set, because I literally know of 3 jobs open where they tell me none of the people were willing to knock doors. And so you can't be an organizer around energy justice if you're not willing to talk to people about these issues. So hope some of you will take that class, and then maybe you will apply for some of these roles that I see out here. But the reality is the environmental movement has a checkered history. And I've been happy to see many larger environmental organizations begin to do some of the hard work to wrestle with that. The environmental movement on the whole comes out of the conservation movement. And the conservation movement, while I agree with many of the things that it focuses on, has a history of saying it is okay to dispossess people of lands, which they were doing a much better job of stewarding, so that we can then create national parks that people will have access to while treating the rest of the land in ways that are abominable. We have reached a point where we are very clear about the impacts and implications of the way we have lived with the land and with all the other species, quite frankly, on whom our lives depend. I would guess that not a single person in here knows how to create oxygen, nor can independently produce water. These are the two central things that human beings need to survive. Now, the best of the best skin divers. I'm a scuba diver, I'm not a skin diver, which means I need a tank and some oxygen while I am diving. But the best of the best skin divers can go without air for 25 minutes. Most of us can barely go 25 seconds. And the best of the best who are in absolute tip-top shape maybe could make it 2 days without water. Most of us would expire even before that. These are the essential things we need to live, and yet we have created a society in which we treat those things as though they're expendable. We pollute the very air we need to live. We allow our children to be born in the womb with asthma. We have created a society that is unclear about the basic things we need to survive. And as was coming up in this conversation about whether or not we should move for the fossil-free standard, this question of whether or not we can afford to make a transition. Now, eco, and many of you, I'm sure some of you take ecology classes, and so you'll know that ecology as a discipline stands with this word eco, which comes from the Greek word oikos, meaning home. Ecology as a tradition, as a discipline, asks you not to see things for their small parts and their cells, but asks you to see things in relationship to the other beings with which we share space. That tradition, that understanding of connectedness, is not at the heart of our societal structures, but it is literally driven into our DNA. And so when we look at this idea of the Green New Deal, there are two central tenets of that Green New Deal that I think we need to focus on. The first is that the economy is usually our excuse for why we cannot honor the ecology. And at its foundation, the Green New Deal says we have a crisis in our ecology and our economy in terms of the way we distribute wealth and resources, and in the way that we produce those wealth and resources that are putting our planet in peril. And so the foundational idea is that we will not choose one over the other. We will pay attention to our ecology and our economy together and try to build something that stops the idea that those two things should be in competition. Because while ecology means the study of home, economy means the management of home. At the foundation, they're both trying to ask the question of how resources and beings should relate to each other. And so the problem in one is deeply tied to the injustice in the other. The second core notion within the Green New Deal is that we have a history of some people consistently being left behind, some people consistently being starved of resources, some communities always being asked to bear the burden of pollution, of toxicity, being starved of the resources they need, even to make sure that the children in those communities can discover and cultivate their God-given gifts from the time that they're born throughout their lifetime. One of the central tenets of the Green New Deal is that those communities that have been left out should be at the front of the line, both in terms of how we distribute resources, but also in terms of the very thinking around how we might save our society. Now, I want to make a clear point. I often hear people, oh, save the planet. Let's be really clear. The planet is going to be okay. Mama Earth will survive. She's been through a lot before she will get through this. The point, though, that we have put her at is the question of whether she has to choose between herself and us. Because we don't know how to act. We don't know how to be in a home that we did not create and just be a decent house guest. The kind of people who open the refrigerator and even though somebody's name is literally written on it are like, I think I should eat that. Go to the bathroom. Don't even flush the toilet. Walk in the house and just leave I'm not describing your roommate. I'm just saying this is the kind of way that we function as part of this home. And mama is trying to decide, like, I love you, but you might have to go. For the health and well-being of everybody else, you might have to go. To make sure that this house even survives, you're literally burning it down. You might have to go. And so we are not fighting to save the planet as if she needs saving from us. We are fighting because we have to change in order for the rest of the species to be able to survive. And if we don't change, not only will we not survive, we won't deserve to survive. And for me, that means not just figuring out how we live in right relationship with the tiny phytoplankton in the ocean that produce quite a bit of the oxygen we need to breathe, how we live in right relationship with the water that we need to live, how we live in right relationship with the air that we depend on to breathe. But it also means how we live in right relationship with each other and shift the ethos as one of the only species that creates hierarchies of survival in the way that we do. I think we imagine ourselves to be the smartest. But so far, history has shown that we do not always use our smarts in a way that actually makes us better in the large scale of things, which is that all other species are really clear that their first job is to make sure that the next generation survives. All of the rest of the species get that. We are the only ones where older generations steal resources from generations unborn. So I put that as the frame because I've heard lots of descriptions around the Green New Deal is, and most of the time they're just slapping Green New Deal on the same thing they were doing before. Most of the time, I found very few people have even read even the legislation that Congresswoman AOC put out, and very few people have grappled really with the moral, ethical, and operational realities of what that shift would require of us. And I think many of us have pointed fingers at the folks who are completely against the Green New Deal, and that's fine. I have my own frustrations. But have we done the inner soul searching in our own movements, in our own work, in our own communities about whether or not we are uniting ecological justice and economic justice? Whether or not we're asking hard questions about, once again, if we're asking poor people to bear the brunt of our environmental policies, or if we are shifting the burden onto those who actually can afford to pay it. So I want to talk about some very concrete policies, and then I'll pause and we'll have some space. But one of them that I'll lift up, and actually I'm going to just list up two programs and then if you have questions, I'll share others. But how many of you guys have heard of Boston's Burdo Ordinance? Okay, so I definitely need to explain that. Okay, so about 2015, Boston began its process by saying, we're just requiring all of our buildings, larger buildings particularly, to report their emissions. Just report to us how much you're emitting. And it was called Boston's Emissions Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance. We now call it BERDO, and probably the average person in City Hall can't even remember what that acronym stands for because BERDO has become its name. Anyway, we asked people to just report. And that meant that people just had to calculate what they were actually spending, which in many cases, most building owners hadn't even done. Now, this is pretty important because in the city of Boston, buildings account for about 70% of our emissions. All of the things associated with their building, their construction, all of the ways that people use energy, and to some extent, the commute that people make to them. Although when you look at our transportation issues, those are predominantly not, about 25% of our transportation emissions are from the people within the city of Boston. About the other 75% are the people commuting into the city of Boston. So that's a complicated conversation. And I did get to see that the orange line is actually moving. I'm glad to see it because we definitely need to get it back on line. And there's some other work we probably need to do to enhance the MBTA so we can have, I'm not here to talk about the MBTA, but I just need to put in a little plug. And that is certainly a part of the Green New Deal work that Boston is doing, because you can't tell people stop, riding in cars and not give them another viable way to get around. And so it is not by accident that Mayor Wu chose the bus first, because I move on the subway majority of the time, but I grew up on the bus. And more of the people on the bus are the people who do not have other options, putting them first, for whom $1.10 in their pocket makes a big difference, for whom we have often focused on the transportation options open to people who don't have cars. So it is not an accident. The bus that was made free was the 28 bus, which is one of our highest ridership buses in the city of Boston, moving from Ruggles Station to Mattapan Square. But anyway, Berto, coming back, majority of our emissions coming from buildings, high percentage of those buildings, some of our biggest emitters, you may not be surprised, are our hospitals. Our universities also are decent sized emitters because these are buildings that are running really often. Lab space is probably the highest emitter of any of those. And we needed to really sit down with folks and say, we made a commitment to be net zero by 2050, but that's not just going to come out of the sky. We got to start making commitments right now. And so this ordinance says every 5 years, our buildings have to reach a standard to get closer to 2050 when they will all have to reach zero. But what was important about Berto is not just that we put out an emissions standard. Other people have done that. It's not just that we're doing a fossil-free ordinance. Other folks have done it. What was pretty unique about Boston, and the reason we probably get the most calls, is that we put equity provisions right into the policy. So you have to meet your standards, but if you don't meet them, or you have challenges, or you want special consideration, you have to go before a civilian review board. That board is 2/3 appointed by community-based organizations. What we're saying is to our largest landowners, if you, for some reason, cannot comply with these standards, come talk to the people who are directly impacted by your emissions. Come talk directly to people who are living in environmental justice communities and plead your case. And if we want people to comply, that's the first thing I want to say. We want people to make the changes in their buildings. If they don't meet that, we also have some alternative compliance methods, i.e. you can pay in the short term if you don't make that standard. Now we try to make that payment high enough that you're not inclined to do that. But the money that goes into that fund also is decided by the Civilian Review Board to then be invested in communities and environmental justice communities, and specifically for buildings that we think have a legitimate reason why they're struggling. Some of our older buildings, we have a lot of historic buildings. It's beautiful. It is very hard to decarbonize some of those buildings. Some of them are actually great in certain ways, but there are sort of that next layer of technology that can be very challenging in those buildings. Some of our nonprofit buildings, some of our affordable housing buildings become eligible to receive funds from those alternative compliance payments. So it was hard. And we are working through all the regulations, and you would probably not be surprised, because many of you are studying this, about all the complexities. What do we do when the utilities report but a year behind? And how do we create numbers for people that are fair? And how do we reward people who try out an innovative technology if that technology fails to perform at the level they thought? How do we not, we know that we have some of the tools we need, but we don't have all the tools that we need. And we need some of the folks who can afford it to get out there and try things so that they can bring them to market to make them cheaper for everyone else. How do we reward those kinds of things? But what's made it really fascinating is that it is changing the power dynamic of who gets to make the decisions around environmental justice and around the way we address climate. The other program that I'm most excited about, and I invite you to look it up, is Powercore. For a couple of years, including when she was in city council, Mayor Wu first worked on this. Councilor Kinsey Bach then took up this work around introducing a conservation corps. Now, we had hoped there were going to be a significant amount of resources for that conservation corps. No thanks to Washington, D.C., but we're still making it happen anyway. This program, Powercore, is based on a program in Philadelphia that has existed since 2013. But what I think is most exciting about it is it trains young people 18 to 30 with a high school diploma or GED who are not on track for college in green jobs that we can train you in within 1 year that have a living wage, entry level, and a career path. So we are not training people to be in crap jobs where they will be stuck in those crap jobs forever. We are paying attention to where are there industries that are moving so quickly, they're struggling to fill those roles. And because of that, we might be able to get them to look at someone who's a returning citizen, who generally people would not pay attention to because of their record, but they are desperate enough for workers. They'll give that person a chance. And we're making sure that when we send them for that job, they actually have already begun doing some of the work in advance, so they're not showing up cold. So we work directly with the employers to make sure that the curriculum we develop has our folks show up on day one with more direct experience than folks who are coming in cold. I'll just be honest, it is some of our hope that because you all have a wide open landscape, I am training some folks that might be able to beat you out because people are often requiring college diplomas for jobs that have nothing to do with what you've learned in college. And it's locking out folks who should be able to do that work and would be able to feed their family, but they can't get in. So as an example of that, we're looking at urban forestry. Everybody wants to plant trees, but we also got to prune those trees. We got to water those trees. We got to think about soil compaction, a lot of other issues. You don't need a college degree to do 90% of the work in the tree industry. But unfortunately, very few folks in our inner city communities are even being exposed to information about that career track. So Powercore, we launched in June. They are the joy of my life. Like whenever I'm having a bad day at the office or something is like crappy, I'm like, what are you guys doing tomorrow? Because their main building is very close to my house. So I can like stop there on my way to City Hall or see them out in the field. And it's a joy to see young folks from my neighborhood where I grew up in Roxbury out pulling invasives, being able, they're going to start their urban forestry tree work next week. They will also get full chainsaw training, which I'm going to go learn because I would like to learn how to use a chainsaw also. They've been learning things about urban ecology and some of that. So raccoons, as an example, one of them moved into my house. And while I believe in no eviction ordinances, I unfortunately felt we could not share that space because you can't poop on my deck in the corner. And she also wouldn't allow us out on the deck while she was there. So we weren't really sharing the space together. So unfortunately, I do also oversee animal control. And after a couple of days of trying to address it on my own, I had to call a staff person and be like, could you help me move them on to an actual tree as opposed to my third floor deck? I bet you didn't know raccoons are amazing climbers. They are in the bear family, something I learned. So anyway, we're training folks in those careers. Things like smart building technology is also on that list. Composting, a variety of different expanding fields where folks will be able to get their foot in the door. Again, in both of these policies, we're starting with the idea that we do not have to pit the ecology against the economy. We can be looking at the two together. And we can put at the front of the line those folks who've been left out in the past. So I will stop there, and I know I was close to the time, but I have time for a couple of questions. Anybody? Question, thought? So up until we passed the second layer of the ordinance, so the first part of it was just you have to report. And then the second piece was now there are consequences. So 2025 is when the first standard moves, right? You basically, there's a bunch of different types of buildings, and you have a certain emission standard depending on the kind of building that you run. Some of them are mixed. So as an example, Tufts is obviously not in Boston, but we do have other universities that have, 30 buildings, right? They have to go actually building by building, classify what kind of building it is. Sometimes it's a mixed building. And so right now we're actually getting tons of calls as we negotiate with people. What is this building considered? Now, this one's pretty easy. It would go under the auditorium category, right? Auditorium and houses of worship have a specific category. But if the next building over were a lab, it's in a different category. So really doing the work of clarifying what all the people's buildings are. Sometimes people are hiring outside folks to help them do some of that work. We have to certify that those folks, sort of meet our standards of the kind of sort of skill set that we're looking for and what they are able to deliver to people. So right now we're in the process of having people report. Some of them are in pretty good shape because they did the work before. I'm gonna be honest with you. There were definitely people who should have been reporting before that weren't. Now they're freaking out because they know that in 2025 they'll be held accountable. So there's a lot of more people entering the system that had not paid attention before. But 2025 is our first cutoff where you actually have to report and you get measured up against what your buildings are doing or not doing. Yeah, I see all the way.
Just because we have a lot of folks online, so.
Thank you. What concrete steps is the city of Boston currently taking to increase access to public transport and biking and reduce car dependency in the city?
Yeah, so I can talk a lot about what we're doing in terms of biking. I think in terms of public transport, one of the big challenges is almost all of our public transit is run by the MBTA, which is a state-based agency. And we have some seat at the table, but we don't have any enforcement mechanism. So most of it has been relationship building and trying to work with the T. So like, for instance, the free bus pilot, city is paying for that. Like the T is not, just sort of doing it out of goodness, but it has certainly bought some goodwill because it actually makes the buses run more efficiently. But I can talk about what we're doing specifically on bikes because we actually just made a pretty big announcement on Tuesday around that. We've now taken a lot of resources. We've been committed to complete streets for a long time. We were one of the sort of early places to really push that in the country, but we've been needing to do a lot more to actually meet that goal. And so now we're doing a lot more with our new development to really push that complete streets mandate. And then we've just announced about our sort of push to do about another 4 miles of bike lanes. Key thing being not as random, right? So we have often put in a bike lane because there's a construction project and it's a great place. But for any of you who have ever ridden on bikes, it doesn't work if you have like 2 blocks that have this amazing bike lane. And then right after that, you like end up in an intersection where you're like, I'm taking my life into my hands. So we are trying to make sure that the bike lines that we create, one, heavily are in our environmental justice community. So it becomes a real option for people to bike. People do bike already, but they are taking their lives into their hands. So we want to make sure that those connections are stronger. And then there's also a whole bunch of initiatives to get more, particularly folks who identify as women biking, because often they were not taught to bike as children. People just don't often make that investment. We have a lot of folks from a lot of places around the world. Sometimes people didn't have access to bikes, so they couldn't have ever learned to bike. So making sure that we are teaching people to bike. all across the board, there are classes, but there's some specific emphasis on women because we find that there's some other layers of concern. And then some subsidies for older adults and young people. My father started biking, he's 70. And I found out Counselor Kinsey Bach, whose mother has also started biking to work. I don't know how old her mom is, so I'm not gonna say, but I'm saying we're of the same generation. So like I'm sure she's, anyway, trying to make it viable for people and for people with mobility challenges to access e-bikes. Because again, you could do 80%, but then you hit this hill, and that hill is one that you need to get to the place you want to go. Now you aren't willing to bike. With e-bikes, you can ride the bike as you would in many places, and that's fine. But if you need a little bit of help, an e-bike can allow you to get the extra help you need to be able to get up that hill, or to be able to move with a kind of speed you might not be able to do on your own. So I think there's a whole bunch of money, and much of that is ARPA funded, but it also is just taking the dollars that we already have, the money we are already going to spend on repaving or other kinds of traffic calming, and uniting it. And it is worth noting that we're not just paying attention to bikes. We are also looking at traffic calming for walkers. And we believe in the end, it will also support drivers to drive in a more generous way and a safer way. I know that many of you probably get around on public transit and you have not driven in Boston. It's better than Cairo, where I felt like I cannot even literally look out the window, or else I'm gonna feel like my life is flashing before my head every moment, but it's bad. We could do better. We could do much better in the way that we drive, particularly on our old horse paths where people are just like making up rules. So we're trying to put all of those together. And I think your question connects with another sort of key piece. People should not experience environmental shifts as something like that negatively has to impact their lives. And we do have drivers who are upset about losing parking. But part of what we're saying to folks is, you wouldn't have to drive your young people everywhere if they could get around, if your teen could get around safely on a bike. They would have a level of freedom to do more programs, to do more things. You wouldn't have to pick them up and drop them off all the time, but we need to make sure that they can move safely. We need to make sure that people who choose to bike back and forth to work can do so safely. There are fewer people in the city of Boston now than there were at our height, where we were about almost 800,000 at our height, but there's more cars. It's just not viable. We cannot keep adding more people and just think that everybody's going to be able to buy the car. And like, it's already crazy from a traffic perspective. So if more people can get out on bikes and get out and walk and get out and use public transportation, and it feels safe to do so, we will all stop sitting in these ridiculous traffic jams that make you want to pull your hair out and stop emitting at the same time. So I don't know how much time I have, or
Questions?
Yes, I can take a couple. I saw there was one young woman back here, and I saw there's a brother right there. I saw them, so the two of you,
Hi, thanks so much for this. One question: for all of these initiatives, whether buildings or transportation or otherwise, could you speak to some of the sources of public advocacy, some of the entities and organizations that have been most forceful in moving City Hall and moving the politics to this point on the local Boston level?
Okay, yes. So I would say on the one I just spoke in terms of bikes has been a lot of the biking community. Folks that use bikes on a regular basis, including there's a pretty amazing organization called Bikes Not Bombs that was created years ago, where they teach young people not just to ride bikes, but to repair bikes. We recently gave them a grant, I think for $500,000, to teach their young folks how to repair e-bikes, because people are not going to ride bikes if they don't have anywhere to get them repaired. And what better place than teaching young people of color to repair bikes. So that's an example of, they have been in the conversation pushing for this, but they've also been in the conversation around how we also increase the infrastructure, and there are resources going to them to help do that. Mattapan Food and Fitness has also been pretty key. Mattapan is a neighborhood that has, they have the trolley, but they're like one of the neighborhoods that doesn't really have a subway system. So everybody's on buses there, which means that everybody's having to use the streets, and a lot of people want to be able to bike, but it's a distance, and it is very hard to get there. Now, the Boston Alexa bike mayor, and Vivian Ortiz is our bike mayor, who's from Mattapan. So Vivian is a force for like biking and safety, and particularly getting women and immigrant women on bikes. So that's, she's been pretty engaged in that. And there's others, livable streets. Then with Berto, there's a lot of folks within the Green Justice Coalition have been pretty involved in that. ACE, Alternatives for Community Environment, and Boston Climate Action Network were the two groups that spearheaded that with ACE. As it turns out, I was the staff person facilitating the Green Justice Coalition before I came into the city. So I was pretty involved on both sides of that. We've got an initiative around solarization, and that's Green Roots in Chelsea, but it's Chelsea and East Boston have been really engaged in particularly a lot of this community outreach there. We're trying to increase uptick of not just solar, but solar with batteries attached to them, because East Boston is extremely vulnerable because it's surrounded by water, both the Chelsea Creek and the Atlantic Ocean. And because of that, when sea levels rise and when we have storms, they're very easily cut off from the rest of the city, and therefore cut off from some of the grid resources. So we've been adding batteries to that so that those systems are not just providing power during the day, but in the case of a real emergency, people have that backup battery, which could be life-saving for folks who need electricity. So there have been a number of different groups that are playing a role in that. Gosh, I could keep going. There's some other stuff around energy. So I can give a larger list, but yeah, there have been a lot of great groups engaged in that conversation. And then did you get it? Did she get to ask it? She's had her hand up like since the beginning. So I just
please pass in the interest of time if you want, but just from a research perspective,
Yeah.
doing economic research,
Yeah.
that can't make your value decisions for you, obviously.
Yeah.
Like it's just supporting, it can give you more information. If you have any thoughts on where economic research or other research would help make the case for policies or help like refine policies, maybe that's.
I can name two things that I know people have done. And we're actually in a project right now with the Army Corps, which is also trying to push the envelope and have been given the heads up to do that. So one of the things that from a resilience perspective, I didn't talk a ton about resilience, but we do a lot of resilience work, is really being able to calculate the damage based on like, what do we know about the climate impacts and where we're going? What do we know about what that means in terms of storms, in terms of heat, loss of life? And then suddenly our interventions look so cheap and so effective when you look at what happens if you don't do them. I will name this lot of focus on sea level rise, very important. Boston has 47 miles of coastline, so we have spent a lot of energy that. But a lot of what we're talking right now is around issues of heat. More people die from heat. Many more people die from heat than die from sea level rise. And so really pushing that. It gets complicated though, because I know when we were trying to put out our heat plan, they wanted to do a cost benefit analysis. And I feel very uncomfortable with looking at people's lives with a cost benefit analysis. Because I just think there's a whole bunch of values around whose lives are worth more and not like, so I have some challenges and concerns around that. And that's a little bit of an issue because it's easy to do a cost benefit analysis around buildings, which are less affected by heat, but much more affected by flooding than it is with heat, where more people are affected. And so there we use health research probably better than economic research because of some of the values issues, I think, in sort of codifying people's life. But the one thing people have done in the in-between is look at healthcare costs. That I'm okay with. How many more asthma attacks might we have how much more stress that might put on our ERs, because that's not putting a value on people's lives. It is putting a value on things that can be quantified financially. I don't think human lives should ever be on the list of things that can be quantified financially.
Talk.
Thank you.
Last event on people's calendars. On Monday, September 19th, we are bringing back another environmental studies tradition. Outside of Barnum Hall at noon, we will be having the annual environmental lunch, where we try to bring together all of the different units working on environmental issues for some social time. Thank you all.